Hello friends, today I am starting a lecture series on various topics of ENT. So my first topic is surgical anatomy of skull base. Let's begin. So what is the skull base? It forms the floor of cranial cavity and it separates the brain from other structures. What are the other structures? We will look further in the upcoming slides. Basically there are two views to observe the anatomy of skull base. One is superior, that is we are viewing the skull from the top side, and another is the inferior, that is we are viewing from below. There are few bones also. Two are paired bones, that is frontal and temporal bone, and there are three unpaired bones, that is ethmoid, sphenoid, and occipital bone. Now we will look at the skull base from the inferior side. Anteriorly, there is a structure that we all know, that is bony palate. It is formed by two bones. First is palatine process of maxilla that forms the two-third part of the bony palate, and one-third part is constituted by the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Along with these bones, there is a small, very small fossa that is known as incisive fossa, and there is an alveolar arch. Posteriorly, the bony palate ends into a spine-like structure that is known as posterior nasal spine. What is the importance of this spine? That is, it gives attachment to a muscle that is known as musculus uvulae. Also, there are two foramens. One is greater palatine foramen and another is lesser palatine foramen, which are situated very close to the lateral border of the hard palate. As we can see in this diagram, what I have told you till now, this is the view of a skull base from the inferior side or from the lower side. There is a bony palate. As we can see in this diagram, it is formed by two bones. Larger two-third part is formed by the palatine process of maxilla, and smaller one-third part is formed by the horizontal plate of the palatine bone. Also, we can see a small fossa-like structure anteriorly that is known as incisive foramen, and also there are two small foramens. One is greater palatine foramen and lesser palatine foramen on the lateral border of the hard palate. About the anterior part that was visible in the skull base on looking from the inferior side. Now we come to the middle part of the norma basalis, or that we also know as skull base. So middle part is formed by the basi occiput along with basi sphenoid. Also there is greater wing of sphenoid and contribution by the apex of petrous temporal bone along with the occipital condyle and pterygoid plates. Now next is the posterior part. So posterior part is majorly formed by the occipital condyles along with the squamous and condylar part of the occipital bone with foramen magnum. So this is a diagrammatic representation of the inferior view of the skull base. This is just for the orientation. There are various unlabeled structures in this diagram that we will discuss further in the upcoming slides. There is anterior part of the skull base, middle part and posterior part. Now we come to the superior view of the skull base. From superiorly, again it has been divided into three parts, that is anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. Anterior cranial fossa extends from the frontal bone to the free border of lesser wing of sphenoid and anterior clinoid process. The middle cranial fossa, it extends from the anterior border of sulcus chiasmaticus to the anterior margin of foramen magnum. And posterior cranial fossa, it extends from the superior border of petrous part of the temporal bone to the squamous part of the occipital bone. As these three are very important structures, and there are various numerous structures which pass through these fossa that we will discuss later on. Diagrammatic representation of skull base superior view, as here we can see the part that is colored with the blue is anterior cranial fossa, next is the middle cranial fossa, and the third part, which is carrying a large central hole, that is known as foramen magnum, that is the posterior cranial fossa. We will look at each of the cranial fossa one by one. First is anterior cranial fossa. The boundaries are very important from the exam point of view. Anteriorly and laterally, it is formed by the posterior wall of frontal bone. Posteriorly, it is formed by the lesser wing of sphenoid and body of sphenoid bone. Medially, there are two parts, horizontal part and vertical part. Horizontal part is formed by the cribriform plate of ethmoid, and vertical part is formed by the perpendicular plate of ethmoid and crista galli. The floor of the anterior cranial fossa is formed by the orbital plate of frontal bone, ethmoid bone, and anterior aspect and lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. So anterior cranial fossa lies over the nasal cavity and orbital cavity. It is separated from the nasal cavity by a bony plate, that is cribriform plate of ethmoid, and it is separated from the orbits by the orbital plate of the frontal bone. Now we come to the contents of the anterior cranial fossa. First is frontal lobes of cerebral hemispheres. As we all know about the cerebral hemispheres, so only frontal lobe lies into the anterior cranial fossa. There are a few bony landmarks such as frontal crest that gives attachment to the falx cerebri, and midline of the ethmoid, that is crista galli, that again gives attachment to the falx cerebri. There is also an anterior clinoid process which arises from the lesser wing of sphenoid, and it gives attachment to the tentorium cerebelli. What are the foramens situated into the anterior cranial fossa? On either side of crista galli or cribriform plate, there are olfactory nerve fibers which pass into the nasal cavity. There is an anterior ethmoidal foramen which gives passage to the anterior ethmoidal nerves and vessels. There is a posterior ethmoidal foramen which gives passage to the posterior ethmoidal nerves and vessels. Also, there is a foramen cecum that is between the frontal and ethmoid bone that gives passage to the emissary veins. As here we can see in this diagram of anterior cranial fossa, the anterior boundary here it is formed by the posterior border of the frontal bone, and posterior boundary is formed by the lesser wing of sphenoid and body of sphenoid bone. This yellowish portion is the body of sphenoid. Medially, there are two structures, that is cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, and vertical part is formed by the crista galli. Come to the applied aspects related to the anterior cranial fossa and its structures. So if there is any trauma or if there is any injury to the cribriform plate, there are mainly two major consequences of the fracture of the cribriform plate. Number one is anosmia, that occurs because of the shearing or tearing of the olfactory nerve fibers in the injury. Second is the CSF rhinorrhea, that occurs due to the tear of meningeal covering of brain by the bony fragments. We come to the middle cranial fossa that forms the central part of the cranial floor. It is formed by three bones. One is a sphenoid bone and other two are the two temporal bones of the right and left side respectively. Now what are the boundaries of the middle cranial fossa? Anterolaterally it is formed by lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Anteromedially it is formed by anterior clinoid process. Posterolaterally it is formed by superior border of petrous part of the temporal bone. And posteromedially it is formed by the dorsum sella of the sphenoid bone. The floor of the middle cranial fossa is constituted by body and greater wing of sphenoid along with the squamous and petrous part of the temporal bone. So what are the contents of the middle cranial fossa? It lodges two important structures. One is pituitary gland and other is temporal lobes of the cerebrum. The middle cranial fossa is marked by the numerous bony landmarks. In its center part, one important landmark is body of the sphenoid bone, which contains sella turcica that lodges the pituitary gland. So sella turcica is again divided into three parts. First is tuberculum sella. Second is hypophyseal fossa that forms the floor which is related to the sphenoidal air sinuses, the sphenoid sinus that we know commonly. The floor is formed by the hypophyseal fossa. Third is the dorsum sella. It is a square-like bony projection projecting upwards into the sella turcica. Now we will look at the various foramens and fissures which are present in the middle cranial fossa one by one. First of all, in the sphenoid bone, there is a canal which is known as optic canal. What they transmit? They basically transmit the optic nerve and ophthalmic artery into the orbits. Second is the very important structure, that is superior orbital fissure. It is divided into three parts by a common tendinous ring. What are these three parts? Number one is lateral part, second is intermediate, and third is medial part. The lateral part contains three nerves only, that is lacrimal nerve, frontal nerve, and trochlear nerve. The intermediate part again contains three nerves: oculomotor nerve, that is third nerve that we all know, nasociliary nerve, and abducens nerve. Third part is the medial part that carries single structure, that is inferior ophthalmic vein. So here we can see the diagrammatic depiction of the middle cranial fossa. All the important foramens and fissures that we have studied just now are here in this diagram. So as we can see, first of all, the superior orbital fissure is visible, one on each side. There is no division visible here in this diagram by the common tendinous ring, but it is visible as a whole fissure. Also, there is an optic canal. There is foramen lacerum, foramen ovale, foramen rotundum, foramen spinosum, carotid canal, and hiatus for the greater petrosal nerve. We will see all these foramens and the structures which are passing through them in the upcoming slides very soon. Here are the other named foramens which were visible in the diagram. Foramen rotundum gives passage to the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve. Foramen ovale gives passage to the four structures. Number one is mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, that is fifth nerve, accessory meningeal artery, lesser petrosal nerve, along with the emissary veins. Foramen spinosum gives passage to the middle meningeal artery and nervus spinosus, that is the recurrent branch of the mandibular nerve. As these are the very important foramens for the exam point of view, and the structures traversing through them are also very important to remember. In the temporal bone, there are three major foramina. Number one is hiatus for the greater petrosal nerve. Second is the hiatus for lesser petrosal nerve. And third is the carotid canal, which gives passage to the internal carotid artery, and it is situated posterior-medial to the foramen ovale. Also, there is another important foramen that is known as foramen lacerum, which is situated at the junction of three bones, that is sphenoid, temporal, and occipital bones. Foramen lacerum gives passage to the meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery along with the emissary veins. Now coming to the posterior cranial fossa, it is made up of three bones. One is occipital bone and other two are the temporal bones, that is one on each side. Coming to its boundaries, anteromedially it is formed by the dorsum sella of sphenoid, which was the part of sella turcica which we have studied previously, and anterolaterally it is formed by superior border of the petrous part of temporal bone. Posteriorly it is formed by internal surface of a squamous part of the occipital bone, and floor of the posterior cranial fossa is formed by mastoid part of the temporal bone, squamous and basilar part of the occipital bone. Boundaries of the posterior cranial fossa are important, as there are many a times short notes comes in the exam about the boundaries of all these cranial fossas like anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, or posterior cranial fossa. Now coming to the contents of the posterior cranial fossa, it contains brainstem, which is a very important structure, and cerebellum. In the temporal bone, there is an opening that is known as internal acoustic meatus, which is an oval opening in the posterior aspect of the temporal bone. It is 1 centimeter in length and it transmits various important structures. These are facial nerve, vestibulocochlear nerve, that is eighth nerve, and labyrinthine artery. In the occipital bone, there is a large foramen that is known as foramen magnum. As we can see from its name itself, magnum is suggestive of its large size. It is oval in shape. The dimensions are 3.5 centimeter anterior-posteriorly and 3 centimeter transversely. It is divided by a ligament that is known as alar ligament into anterior small and posteriorly large compartments. Now, what are these two compartments of the foramen magnum? The anterior compartment is basically osteoligamentous, that contains apical ligament of Dens, upper band of cruciate ligament, and membrana tectoria. The posterior compartment is a neurovascular compartment that contains lower part of medulla oblongata, meninges, fourth part of vertebral artery that is also surrounded by a sympathetic plexus of nerves, and spinal root of accessory nerve, anterior and posterior spinal arteries, and also cerebellar tonsils. Here we can see in this diagram there is a large central foramen that is known as foramen magnum, and on the lateral side of the foramen magnum there are various other structures, foramina, such as jugular foramen, hypoglossal canal, internal acoustic meatus, etc. So we will study further each one by one and their contents. Now we come to the jugular foramina, which is present on either side of the foramen magnum. It is bounded in front by jugular fossa of petrous part of the temporal bone, and behind it is bounded by the jugular notch of the occipital bone. Three parts of the jugular foramina, that is anterior, intermediate and posterior part. Anterior part contains inferior petrosal sinus. Posterior part contains internal jugular vein as a continuation of sigmoid sinus that lies into the mastoid bone, and the intermediate part, which contains ninth, 10th and 11th cranial nerve along with the meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery and emissary veins. Here we can see in this image of the jugular foramen, there are nerves passing through the jugular foramina. Here it is the jugular spine, and these three nerves are the ninth, 10th and 11th cranial nerve in the jugular foramen just below the jugular spine. Now coming to the other few canals present in the posterior cranial fossa, one is hypoglossal canal, which lies below the occipital condyles. It transmits 12th cranial nerve, that is hypoglossal nerve, and meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery along with the emissary vein. Now there are few clinical applied aspects related to the posterior cranial fossa. One is cerebellar tonsillar herniation, that is the downward displacement or hanging of the cerebellar tonsils through the foramen magnum. This phenomenon, also known as coning, it is caused by raised intracranial pressure. What happens from the tonsillar herniation? It can result into death from cardiopulmonary arrest. Why? Because tonsillar herniation results into the compression of pons and medulla, which also contain important centers for the control of cardiac rhythm and respiratory rhythm. So this was an important clinical aspect related to the posterior cranial fossa. So this image is a depiction of almost all the structures of the skull base which are important, all the bony landmarks, all the foraminas present in the skull base, and the boundaries of anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. Now coming to the few more clinical aspects related to the surgical anatomy of the skull base, there are few syndromes basically. Number one is superior orbital fissure syndrome. In this, there are three cranial nerves which gets involved, that is third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerve. Clinical features of this syndrome will be patient having fixed globe, dilated pupil, and patient will present with ptosis. Second is the orbital apex syndrome. In this, there will be the clinical features of superior orbital fissure syndrome will be present, and also there is involvement of ophthalmic artery, optic nerve, and superior ophthalmic vein. Patient will present with vision changes, and on examination there will be papilloedema. Third is the Wernicke syndrome that involves cranial nerve 9th, 10th, and 11th. And fourth is the Collet-Sicard syndrome that involves cranial nerve 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. There are various other syndromes. There is a long list, but these few are which are important for the exam point of view. Thank you guys for joining with me as I'm starting now a lecture series and a quick recall series on various ENT topics. So please write down your remarks in the comment section below and mention if there is any topic that you need lecture on that particular topic of ENT. I will definitely try to cover that in the upcoming videos. Thank you very much for joining with us. Keep learning, keep growing. Please like, share and subscribe my channel.